I love speaking right after lunch. You get that feeling, you know? So I'm Turk. It's good to meet you. I'm head of words and pictures at Flox, otherwise known as head of marketing. I may be the first marketer to address you at a Nix conference. If anyone bothered by being spoken to by a marketer? No, okay. So I'm head of words and pictures at Flox, which means that my job is to explain things and tell stories and make things that help people adopt what we make and explain what we do. And one of the reasons that we look into Nix in the wild is because I believe that we're on a very similar path. Like, we're trying to help everybody figure out how to adopt Nix, particularly in the enterprise. That's one of our jobs. And in figuring this out, a lot of the stumbling blocks that people are going to run into with Nix are things that we're very, very interested in understanding. And also, we're interested in helping people get over these stumbling blocks. And so that's one of the reasons that we're doing Nix in the wild. But also, whoa. I went to the next slide, and now it says loading. And now I dance. See, we waited for this, and it's very important. So Nix in the Wild is a collection of stories, a collection of case studies about people who are using Nix in the wild, in live teams for production purposes with actual people. These are stories from everyday users of Nix in the enterprise. And this is gonna be great. So stories from actual people in actual enterprises. And we do it because we want to showcase successful users of Nix. And the reason we want to do this is to diminish fear and encourage broad adoption of Nix. We also want to create a source of Nix problem statements, something that we can all look at and say, like, all right, in this user story, there's a problem statement that perhaps we can all address. I also think it's important for us at Flox to contribute to the Nix community in this way and earn some goodwill. So there's a lot of reasons that we do Nix in the wild. The process, see, this has no artwork, so there's no like loading process. This is a very art-heavy thing going on here. The process for Nix in the wild is a really straightforward process. We're trying to keep it very, very simple right now. So first thing I want to say is it's a team effort. Nix in the wild is not just me. It's a team effort, and largely it's these three folks. So we have Steve Sawyer, who's not here today, but will be here tomorrow or Saturday. You can find him at the Flox booth. Steve Sawyer's the writer. When we interview people about their stories, Steve is the one who captures the story and figures out what the salient points are and does the actual production of the article. Tom Breckney is standing outside. He's the one who interviews everybody. So when we have these conversations with people, he's the one who tries to pull everything out of all these little nooks and crannies of things that they found or things that they experienced. And then I create all the artwork. I do all the reviews. I actually publish the articles and do all of the sort of mechanicals behind the scenes. And I'm here talking to you about it today. But it's a team effort, and it's a really simple process. We're not trying to do anything very complicated here. It's very straightforward. You click a link on nixinthewild.com. It takes you to an email thing. You send us an email. We book time together. We spend 45 to 60 minutes doing an interview. And then we go away. We write the article. We review the article. That part can take a really long time, depending on what else is going on. And then we publish. It's very simple, but we always go back to the original person who gave us the story and make sure that they approve the final copy of it, because we want to make sure that it's their story. So if you have a Nix story in here, we would love to capture your Nix story. This is how you get your story told, and we'll work with you to make sure that it's exactly the one that you want to tell. I'm going to learn to do it earlier so that, okay. We ask very basic questions in Nix in the Wild. We're not starting with anything too terribly complicated. We ask you, who are you? What do you do? How did you first come across Nix, and what was your journey? What was the journey like? What made you first interested in Nix initially? What did your adoption motion look like? How long did it take? What were the stumbling blocks along the way? And how did Nix help you better serve your needs? And what does Nix have yet to satisfy for your team? We're trying to really probe, what are you planning to do next? What are your hopes and dreams? What would you tell somebody in your situation who's about to encounter the things that you encountered? So these are the types of questions that we ask people in this Nix in the Wild interview. Again, it takes about 45 to 60 minutes. And the result is a series of articles that you can find on nixinthewild.com. So I've highlighted 6 of them here. We try to make really interesting artwork for each of them to make it sort of vibrant and exciting, and they end up being articles, and these articles are in various length. We started them off, they were kind of short, and lately they're getting really, really long as we're finding more and more interesting points to bring up for people and things to pull out. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time going through some of our featured stories. Again, you can see them at nixinthewild.com, but I want to pull out some pull quotes for you here. The first one from Bellroy. Who's familiar with Bellroy, the lifestyle company? Some hands? So they sell wallets and other things for lifestyle accessories. And I have several of their wallets, so I was very surprised to learn that they're a Nix shop. And I love this quote from the Bellroy folks. Eventually, we needed it for things we couldn't do otherwise. So how do you describe that? Maybe like this. Nix isn't a tick all the boxes type thing. It just makes the seemingly impossible possible. And these folks are using it for most of their operation now. It's a very good story in Bellroy. This is also an example of somebody who, the person, Jack Kelly at Bellroy, who sat for this story, made heavy edits on the story and has actually a joint byline on this. So we really told this story together. Another one I'd like to highlight is PDT Partners. PDT Partners is a quant fund, and they're a Python shop. And they've shifted everything over to Nix, all the way through, their build process all the way through. And one thing that's really interesting about them is that their quote is, it's easy to look at Nix and dismiss it, to underestimate it, but then burn so much time working around the problems that Nix would solve. And they concluded that doing things the right way is worth it in the end. I thought that was a really good take. And you'll see when I get to the end that there are some takeaways from all of these that I'm going to sort of coalesce. This sort of hints at one of them. Another one I'd like to highlight is SIFT Technologies. This is not a direct quote, but SIFT developers appreciate the reassurance provided by the ability to roll back configurations when needed. They emphasize the ability to trace chains of trust, praising Nix for providing a level of proof and guarantees that other package management systems lack. This is an organization who's using this for dev shells and the CI system, and it helps them be more consistent from beginning to end through everything that they do. All right, Looker. Who has used Looker? Is anyone familiar with this technology from Google? Yeah, Looker is a BI and graphing tool inside of Looker, and their build process evolved from a giant README with tons of detail to a single command. So when new developers come on board to join the Looker development team, they clone a repo, they run one command, and they're up and running with a system. So their onboarding is a whole lot simpler than it used to be. So the reducing time for onboarding the onboarding time is reduced significantly for folks over at Looker. There's actually this is one of my favorite ones, actually. There's a lot of really good detail in this one. The pacing suffers a bit with the load times. The Flying Circus is another really interesting organization. If anybody familiar with Flying Circus, they've been part of the Nix ecosystem for a while. They do something really interesting. They're like a hosting company, but they don't host websites. They host applications. They host your application, and they figure out how to build it with Nix so that they can host it like in a consistent and stable way. They originally started with a, oh shucks, what was it? It's like Gradle and I have it in my notes here. Hang on a second. Ah, yeah, Puppet and Gentoo. So they were a Puppet and Gentoo shop, and they spent a long time building that up. And they kind of concluded that normally 1 + 1 = 2. Puppet and Gentoo should equal 3. Our design tenet is that they should work better together. If you have two separate systems instead of one, then they should become like the integration shouldn't just become a third piece of thing you have to spend time on. So they found that their integration between these two systems was a little bit like too difficult to maintain over time. And using Nix gave them something that was a whole lot simpler. It collapsed multiple problems into one problem. And ultimately, the promise of Nix OS was big enough to convince them to go down a greenfield route. And it gives them the confidence to run their customers' applications, knowing that they'll be stable as time goes on. Also, Occam is a company that does secure end-to-end encryption, making end-to-end encryption super turnkey. Marino from Occam said, I went down the Gradle track. For a little bit, I went down the Bazel track. And yeah, Nix is complicated. It is. But those other things are also incredibly complicated and frustrating in their own right, which I think is another thing I'll say in the takeaways, that people do encounter difficulties with Nix. And sometimes they even turn away from it, and we find that they come back, which is an interesting pattern to observe. And finally, Project IDX. Really good case study here. Project IDX, if you're not familiar with it, is an IDE in the cloud from Google. And when you need a software stack inside that IDE, Nix is what provides you that software stack. I really like the quote here. We quickly started enjoying it for its speed. A lot of this is due to the nature of Nix, that it's an order of magnitude faster. Even without any caching, everything downloads in time. It just runs blazing fast. So they've actually found, they went down the path of containers, and they went really far down the path of containers. And they found that for their use case, they just ended up having too many copies of things. It just wasn't an efficient architecture for their use case, but Nix was, and it gave them this sort of turnkey, everything just works feeling. So I want to coalesce this into a few takeaways. First, starting that Nix is rarely the first choice. If you go through and read a lot of these stories, you'll find a lot of people saying things like, well, we tried this, and we tried that, and we saw Nix, and we were aware of it, but we were scared, or we were reticent, or we weren't willing to confront a learning curve, or we weren't sure the value was going to be there. And so they kind of stepped back and started looking at other things, and for the ones we spoke to, they ended up coming back to Nix because they realized that these other systems weren't satisfying their needs, and that they needed to come back and actually dedicate the time to learn how Nix can do it properly for them. So that was an interesting takeaway, that Nix is rarely the first choice. Another takeaway is that organizations tend to have a Nix nucleus. There tends to be, hey, there's Tom, he poked his head in, he's the one who does the interviews. I mentioned him earlier. There he is, he's running there, yay, look at Tom. Thank you for all your work on Nix in the wild. Second takeaway is that orgs tend to have a Nix nucleus. When we're speaking to somebody inside of an organization who's the Nix champion, they tend to feel really strongly about Nix as an individual, and we hear things from them like, it's sometimes challenging to get other people to come join this project with me. It's sometimes hard to convince them to do it. We have to write a lot of special documentation, or sometimes we have to wrap it in scripts or things like that. So there tends to be a nucleus of people inside of an organization that really know and understand Nix, and they tend to do a lot of the mucking out of stalls when it comes to dealing with Nix. And a lot of them express like, gosh, I wish I had a few more hands on this problem. I just would need to convince my colleagues to like get across that learning curve. The third takeaway is that we're seeing a lot of monorepos. So we think that like the people who have monorepo challenges tend to find a lot of efficiencies in Nix. So interesting observation. Nix tends to start small and expand. It tends to start on a very particular problem that needs a specific solution, and people will find a little bit of success there, maybe in that Nix nucleus, and then Nix nucleus, but sometimes it starts to expand beyond that nucleus. So we found it does tend to start small, which kind of surprises me, because in many ways, like, it's challenging to introduce just a little bit of Nix into an organization, I found sometimes. So that was a surprising outcome to me, that a lot of people have figured out how to do that, figured out how to start really small with a scope that has a small risk and move forward from there. The fifth thing is, Nix loves a complex build. We heard an awful lot of people saying, I don't know, if my build weren't so complex, or I didn't have so many moving parts, or I didn't have so many targets, I might be able to get away with something less complex or less robust than Nix. And so we found a pretty good correlation between complexity of builds and willingness to learn Nix. And the final one is, people tend to like to wrap Nix. They tend to have that nucleus, and then as they break past that nucleus, they tend to say like, look, I just made you a start dev-m script, okay? You just have to run that script, and it'll do the right things, and then you're fine. And so people tend to wrap Nix, is what we found, and make that sort of super bespoke dev-m-like script that everybody gets. And that's it. So thank you for coming and listening to this. If you are interested in being a Nix in the wild, if you have an interesting story, come and find me, or go to nixinthewild.com. If you want some cards for Nix in the Wild, let me know. We have them at the Flox booth. And thank you for your attention. Yes. Do we have questions? Yes. The question is, are the slides going to be available anywhere? And the answer is, now that you've asked, yes. Where will I put them? We'll figure that out. Yeah. Well, they can. Yeah, they can be next to thewild.com. We can put them on maybe Planet Nix. Get everybody to put theirs there. I don't know. Yeah. We'll figure that out as one of our cleanup actions after the show. Other questions? Awesome. Thank you.